There are disasters and there are disasters. In the annals of 21st century marketing, there are few disasters larger than Victoria's Secret's ill-fated attempt to rebrand itself. I don't know if you heard about this, but basically, Victoria's Secret tried to reinvent itself as a feminist woke rebrand, okay? Now, you might be saying, hey, Omer, why are you discussing this trivial nonsense? But I think it's actually a really good lens for us to understand some of the larger changes that are happening in the world around us today. So, Victoria's Secret attempted to reinvent itself as this champion of feminism, literally proclaiming itself an advocate for women. Here, let me read you some quotes. In place of what had arguably morphed into a reductive parade of quasi-soft porn and impossible body standards, there was an arty-looking VS collective and a solemn pledge to advocate for women, a commitment to body positivity and diversity. The message was clear. This was a brand atoning for past non-inclusive sins and giving itself a thorough reputational scrub down. So, why did this fail? Look, that's the wrong question, okay? The right question is, who in their right mind thought this was ever going to succeed? What was going on here exactly? So, what happened was Victoria's Secret tried to relaunch itself as this, feminist, kind of advocate for women, power brand. And of course, young people turned around and said, what on earth are you thinking? Right? So who thought this was a good idea? Who thought this was ever going to work? Because, here's a really good description of what it stood for, what it spent decades building up. The brand that created the high kitsch male fantasy, women in lingerie and angel wings, is being criticized as being boring and utilitarian. So that's a very good description, right? This high kitsch male fantasy. So Victoria's Secret, the runway, the angels, skinny girls in lingerie kind of walking down at the male gaze, right? So it spent decades. So Victoria's Secret was a pioneer way back in the day, right? Of what is now a kind of economy that's fading and falling apart. It was kind of one of the first companies to really offshore production, okay? And then kind of rebranded this is the stuff that it made, which was, made very cheaply and produced overseas by low-cost labor, to then brand it aspirationally. And through that, they earned these huge profit margins. And the way that they branded it aspirationally was with this high kitsch male fantasy, as the quote says, women in lingerie and angel wings, going down runways, the whole 9 yards. So that was the old model. And what happened over the last 20 years is that the world changed. So the world changed in really profound ways, right? So one obvious way that the world changed is that young people are much, much more demanding in terms of purpose and impact and, companies generally trying to make the world a better place. So it's a pretense that companies often have that they think they can kind of like greenwash or good wash and immediately everything will be kosher and cool with people. But it's not that simple. In this case, people said, hey, man, if you have spent, 30 years building up this brand, which is perceived by, many as kind of misogynistic and very kind of like, perpetuating these old beauty standards, male gaze and stuff, why are you suddenly backtracking? How can we trust you? Isn't this just a game? Do you really stand for this, right? So on one level, there's a very basic issue of credibility and authenticity. But there's another thing happening. And that's kind of the way to think about it in orthodox terms, right? But there's another thing happening here that I think is even more interesting, which is that the old model of consumption is not working anymore. And if we try, and one of our jobs as on the inside, if we're leading institutions or corporations, is trying to figure out, well, what are we doing here now? How do we repair our broken relationships? What role are we playing in the world today? So let me explain to you what I mean by that. I'm going to throw up again here what I call the most important chart in the 21st century. Okay, so you can see happiness, flatlining, that's positive affect or even falling, and negative affect exploding over the last decade, right? Distress, despair, anguish, whatever you want to call it. So we have happiness flatlining or declining and unhappiness exploding. And what that tells us is that we're in a real crisis of well-being, okay? So along come marketers or traditional corporations or organizations, whatever you want to call them, and they're selling people the same thing in the same way, or maybe trying to change it a little bit. But you see, people have fundamentally changed in this era. What this chart tells us is that the old model of consumption isn't working anymore. So what do I mean by that? Well, the old model was, keep buying stuff, it'll make you happier. Okay? And what this shows us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that that is not the case anymore. It hasn't been the case for a decade or more. We're not finding happiness through more stuff, or stuff branded and sold in the old way, or stuff marketed to us in the old way. So that is why especially younger generations are becoming much more demanding, because it's not just that there's some kind of moral imperative here, right? That they're suddenly like better people than the old generations. No. It's that actually the old model of consumption isn't delivering. It's not delivering happiness, it's not delivering well-being, it's not delivering what, my terms I call eudaimonia, the old ancient Greek word for a life well lived. So that is why young people especially are becoming more demanding, but that's an effect we see through generations as well. So what people are looking for is much, much higher levels of meaning, purpose, authenticity, well-being. They're looking for their lives to really be impacted and transformed. So that's what they're really looking for. But before that, there's an element of trust and credibility that comes into play, right? And as this kind of explosion of unhappiness and despair washes over the world, social norms are changing. And people are beginning to say, well, a lot of those old standards and norms are not working for us anymore. We need to find ways to live better lives, and those things are toxic to us. So that's why beauty standards have been changing. That's why social mores have been changing, not just in beauty, but in many ways, in terms of how we share our lives, interact with people, what kinds of things we feel comfortable discussing. You can, of course, think of Me Too and social movements like that. So people are really changing. They're in the midst of profound change. Okay, and as these norms and values begin to change and people become much more demanding, they also become much more intolerant and much more suspicious and much more hostile towards the very organizations that they feel were responsible for some of the norms and values perpetuating so much unhappiness. And so that's the situation that Victoria's Secret found itself in. People said, hey man, if you've been the arbiter of the male gaze for decades, why are you coming along and trying to tell us that now you believe that suddenly, the world should be a fairer, better place? It doesn't work. So if we want to reconnect with people in whatever role, right? It doesn't matter really if you're like a brand executive or a teacher or professor or what have you. We need to understand that this thing that I call the most important chart of the 21st century, which shows us this explosion in unhappiness, or if you want to put it another way, this implosion in well-being, is the most fundamental change in the world right now. I think it's, in the human world. Anyways, leaving aside things like climate change. And it's really important for us not to try and fake it, right? Not to try and pull the wool over people's eyes, but to really think about it seriously and think about what our role is in a world that is growing so unhappy and so full of despair and anguish. It's not so easy to just turn around to people and say, hey man, I stood for this and now I'm standing for that and everything will be great again. It's not that simple, right? People know it's not that simple. So what is the message there? Well, the message there is that a lot of the old world is going to die over the next, 10, 20 years. Is there really a reason for brands like this to exist anymore? Probably not. And that's why people are increasingly tuning them out. In the bigger picture, is there a lot of reason for a lot of brands to exist anymore? If they're selling us this old model of consumption that is failing in an age of profound unhappiness, probably not. Is there a reason for a lot of institutions, companies, organizations to exist if they're founded on that old model, which is now visibly breaking down? buy more, kill the planet, get unhappier. What's the point? Probably not. They're not going to make it either. So we're going to see a big shakeout over the next decade of the old world versus the new world. And, this is an example of that. So I thought it was a good lens through which to examine a lot of changes in the world. And that's why we're talking about it. Not just at a superficial level of, trying to sell people stuff. I hope you enjoyed that. We'll talk some more about, how the world is changing soon. Thank you. Bye.